else. So our next agenda item today is a presentation from the National Parents Organization. And I'm going to let Carl introduce our presenter. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Lois. As I said, kind of in my introduction, I appreciate that this commission has been open to different perspectives and different understandings, as opposed to just a traditional child support. I do think the Larry and the Child Support Commission or child support community here has been more forward thinking than many other states. So I thank you for that. With that said, Brian Ulrich has been an analyst as much as anything from a child support standpoint for the National Parents Organization. He's been at this for many years. He's looking at with the variety of different perspectives and different approaches. The National Parents Organization. He's been the author of a listing of different issues that are seen from the family perspective within child support. Anyway, as we started to look at economists like Jane Venor, I wanted to make sure that this commission also heard from a different perspective of economics. Anyway, with that said, I'm excited that Brian can be here today, and I look forward to some vigorous debate after he's gone. So thank you.
Thank you, Carl, for the nice introduction. And thank you to the commission for allowing me the time for this presentation. As Carl stated, I work with the National Parents Organization. I'll give you just a quick background. So I'm a divorced parent of a 38 and 34-year-old daughters, and then had a custody situation with my 15-year-old daughter's mother. So I've got 38, 34, and 15-year-old daughters. And I've been a child support payer, just as a side note, for 23 years. I actually had to sit down to figure that out the other day. But I'm not here speaking to you as an individual. I'm here to address policy matters. And I came to understand that there were quite a number of policy areas that I felt, and as I began working with others, they felt needed consideration and improvement. So again, in terms of background, I'm a 4-year degreed accountant. This is an interesting road that I've come down. But I've been involved in family law reform for about 12 years now. And much of that in the earlier years was related to trying to remove obstacles to particularly fathers being able to obtain significant parenting time with their children. We had seen real obstacles and difficulties in that area over the years. And so in my home state of Minnesota, I helped write a bill back in 2012 that we actually got through the House at an equal presumptive parenting time by a 2/3 vote. The Senate watered it down to 35% time presumption. And then our Governor Dayton pocket vetoed it at the end of session. We spent a couple of days in the hallway in front of his office, a dozen of us with signs, walking and marching, and we caught quite a bit of media attention. And to the governor's credit, he did issue a letter when he issued that veto, which was unusual, for a pocket veto. But he said he was really torn about the issues, and that he wanted us to sit down with the various stakeholders and come up with some legislation that he could sign into law. So for 3 years, we met. We had a Hennepin County judge from Minneapolis took up the governor's call, and we met for 3 years with a fair amount of frequency. The Bar Association, legal aid, the matrimonial lawyers, the domestic violence group, which is now called Violence Free Minnesota. But we all came together along with some legislators and even some judges to try to find a way to approach things and make them better. We were able to come up with 18 different bills that were eventually signed into law by Governor Dayton. And some of that related to child support because that issue arose in those discussions, particularly the issue of our parenting time expense adjustment in Minnesota. We had and I'm familiar with yours, I believe it starts at 25% parenting time, and then it's a cross credit up to the 50% of time. And I believe I heard that you're looking to readdress that. But in Minnesota, we had a large cliff, as it's called, where from 0 to 10% time, there was no credit for parenting time. From 10 to 45% time, there was a 12% credit. And at 45.1%, there was a full offset of the support. And so there were considerable battles that went on when the parenting time would start approaching that 45% time. And the legislature appointed a child support work group, and the Commissioner of Human Service has appointed me as a member of that. And we were able to address that, and we now have more of an S-shaped curve. And in fact, we followed Michigan's model. And they since have done some tweaking to theirs. We frankly need to do some tweaking to ours. But it was a vast improvement. And I've had attorneys approach me who found out by the by that I was involved in that, and offered a big thank you, that the conflict had dropped dramatically in that area in our state. We know that when Oregon took away their quote cliff, the same thing we heard from the Oregon Bar Association, from the Oregon Child Support Agency. So we really strongly advocate to, have parenting time expense adjustments start even with the first overnight, and then work their way through the 50% time, so that there isn't a one point at which the parents can where they're set up for conflict, I guess. So anyway, just a little bit more on my background. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I do want you to know where I come from. I was asked to join the National Parents Organization. They are the largest such entity that represents parents in the area of shared parenting. And they ended up a couple of years ago inevitably getting involved in some child support matters and asked me to come aboard as their senior child support researcher. So I've been in that position for the last couple of years. As part of that, I have read the federal statutes and regulations twice, word for word. I also have read all 50 states' guidelines word for word twice. And I can assure you I will not be doing that a third time. I barely had the energy to get through it twice. And have worked with the various state calculators and so on. So I take my work in this very seriously, as does NPO. We want to bring expertise to the table, and we feel that we do. So one of the things I discovered early on in my work was that there really was no definition of child support in the federal statutes or regulations. And I found that really jaw-dropping. I've just randomly, and I encourage any of you to do the same, I've randomly asked friends, coworkers, etc., what do you believe child support is? And the answer, and this is honest, fully honest answer, every one of them has said, well, it's money to help toward the cost of raising a child. That's what they believe it is. And they're quite surprised to find out that back in 1987, when the states were called upon to set their guidelines up, that the premise of it was based on the standard of living the child had enjoyed when the couple was together. And or in some states, it's, to determine what that standard would be if the couple were together now. And back in those days, that's whatever it is, 3 decades or more ago, there was some truth to the fact that there were households primarily led by fathers in terms of income, and more mothers who worked at home with the children. And so, they referred to the child support payers as absent parents, and considered them to need to provide that financial stability and similarity that the children had enjoyed. And while that made some degree of sense, so that the child didn't suffer financially, there's a brutal reality that goes on. And especially now we've got both parents working out in the workforce. There are some big financial hits that parents experience when they go through a divorce or separation. Oftentimes, they're lucky to even keep the same income. The stresses that go on at that time in their lives, schedule changes that might need to occur to support time with the child. It could be a time when incomes more often drop than increase. And on top of that, you've got 2 households that are being supported. And you have court fees, you have lawyer fees often involved. It's trying to maintain that child's standard of living as if the couple were together is an awesome burden to be placed on a child support payer, father or mother. 90% nowadays of the payers are fathers, but I'm going to refer to child support payers in totality as I talk. But anyway, so the federal government left it to the states to set up these guidelines, and that's the path that they went down. I've done a lot of healthcare work and worked with Medicaid a lot, and I try to compare that to the child support program because they both are federal programs, and they both are administered by the states. And I stopped to think, what would have happened to the Medicaid program if the federal government had tossed it out to the states and said, here, you pretty much just go ahead and have at it. It makes me shudder to think about that. The federal Medicaid program has some very highly specific guidelines and requirements. States can opt out of those with Section 1115 waivers. And the states do have some flexibility, but it's really closely overseen by the federal government. And I just want to interject, I had the chance a year ago with our president, Don Hubin, our board chair, and myself. We had the top 3 policy people from federal OCSE on a call for the better part of an hour. And we raised some of the issues I'm going to be talking about here shortly with those folks. And there was an acknowledgement that there are improvements needing to be made in the child support program. Regrettably, and it makes sense, but from their position, the states need to make those changes, not the federal government, because the states are in charge of the guidelines. So, that makes a lot of sense, right? But as I've worked with child support policy in Minnesota with various legislators and the state agency, there's a real reluctance to get too far aside of what they see as the federal guidance. They're very hesitant to make very aggressive changes, feeling that it might not comply with the federal requirements. So there's this catch-22 going on between the federal and state government or state governments. And to the extent that you have federal performance incentives, several of those are impacted by various moves that you might make as a state that legitimately would put you at a disadvantage to the funding that other states can enjoy. So not having things looked at closer on a federal level, I think, is a big mistake. But that being said, to the extent that the child support guideline commissions and the state agencies and the state legislatures can bring some improvements, we're working actively on both of those fronts. Does anybody have any questions right now at this point? Otherwise, I'll get into some more specifics of the research here and ideas we have on policy matters. So on our website, and I didn't provide it, but if you could write it down, or at least me provide it to you, it's sharedparenting.org is the internet site for NPO. And as you go to that homepage, you'll find that there is a child support section in a U.S. map, and it's headed Child Support and the Cost of Raising Children. And so if you click, it says read more. What we did was we looked at what the child support calculations would be if they were based on the cost of raising a child, using what we found to be standard incomes, the payer at $55,000 of annual income, the recipient at $45,000 of income. And so we use that as an income premise and use 35% parenting time as the parenting time ratio, and then calculate it out. Oh, we also adjusted housing. The USDA, as you may or may not know, they calculate the cost of raising children, and several states work with their numbers. That they don't use them purely, but they have determined on a federal level what that number is at 3 different income levels. So at a low income level, a middle income level, and a high income level. So we took that middle income level, we used their numbers that were based on consumer expenditure data, and of course at 35% time or at any significant percent of parenting time that both parents would have, both parents are going to have to provide housing. Even if you have a child every other weekend, you arguably need to have suitable housing for that child. So we took the housing cost out of that, and then of course we took medical and childcare out because those are separate buckets, if you will, in the child support calculation. And then we applied the consumer price index for the state and came up with, okay, here's what the cost of raising the child is on a per state basis. And the numbers that we came up with are in most cases significantly lower than what the child support orders generate using those criteria in each of the states, using their calculators or guidelines. But you can, the data is there for you to peruse and take in. It also showed in some cases dramatic differences across state borders that really don't make a whole lot of sense. If you live 10 miles off of one state's border, it can make a difference of $400 to $500 a month in your child support, which is just nonsensical. But so anyways, please review that information. We are, as an organization, one of the initiatives that we're bringing forward on the federal level is to put a definition of child support into the federal law, and to base it on what we've suggested, the USDA guidelines. We would then apply an income shares to that, and in a parenting time expense adjustment. But we think that needs to be done on a federal level because, understandably, states have too much financially at stake if that change were to be made by just one or several states. It would help in turn. Arguably, you would collect more support of what was ordered at those levels, but the total collections would drop materially. And so that's what the net effect would be for the state to suffer under the incentive formulas. Any questions about that piece? Otherwise, I'd like to get into talking about the what we call issues in child support booklet that I was the lead author on, to really get at from a payer perspective, where the real problem areas.
So I just want to highlight a couple of just points of what you said in different language. Y'all heard me talk about the problem with counting overnights. Brian is advocating counting overnights because he doesn't like the cliffs in the different states. Another option for us to consider as we go forward is kind of more banding of overnights by the count. The second other big thing that Brian was using is, again, this lifestyle adjustment, or the lifestyle language is in most every state's statutes. That is as problematic, if not more so, than the counting of overnights. It is, so certainly one of the things I'm going to be greatly advocating for as we go forward is trying to remove that lifestyle language out of our statutes. But adjusting for lifestyles, trying to make the child's lifestyle pre-divorce to what it is post-divorce is just nuts. And trying to balance it between the homes is, again, nuts. It puts the focus on the parents, not the child. So that's where a large part of the problem is.
So I have a question with the study you just described. So I looked at your map, and for Colorado, they estimate the cost of having a child is $324 a month. And you mentioned that you kind of threw out childcare, which in Colorado can cost, even for one kid, like $1,400 a month just for childcare. Mm-hmm. Can you explain one more time the basis on which you disregard childcare costs as a cost of a child?
Yes. We excluded the medical and childcare from the USDA costs. And we did that because we only were looking at this calculation at the basic support component. So it's not that we don't recognize that there's medical and childcare costs. Those can be significant. But we looked at just simply the basic support bucket of the three buckets, if you will.
So what happens to the child if there's no money if both parents are working? Is there an assumption that childcare is free, or that you take the kid with you to work, or?
No, childcare was, as simply as I can state it, was not addressed in the work that we did. It was simply the basic child support calculation.
Okay, so like $324 a month would get you maybe a week of childcare in Colorado, not to mention any other expenses. I'm also curious, why are you using USDA figures instead of HUD figures for the cost of housing?
That the USDA calculates the cost of raising a child. Several states recognize that work they do and the use of the data that they use to support it. So that's why we chose the USDA.
And sure, again, just to highlight again the translation, at least in my mind, he's not ignoring the child care costs or taking care of child care costs, but that I guess more in my vernacular, that is a shareable expense between the parties, and but outside of the basic calculations.
It's not even considered in here because we recognize that's a separate calculation in a child support order. We were looking just at the basic support component of the order.
I have a question. Similarly, it says that housing expenses are excluded. And what does that mean for a parent who is only capable of earning minimum wage because, let's say, that that was a financially dependent spouse during the marriage, and then afterwards at minimum wage in Colorado, there's no way that a full-time minimum wage worker could afford to house, say, like 5 children. But if the other parent who has, perhaps for good reason, very limited parenting time, and the children are not able, maybe there's been a finding that it is unhealthy for the children. So, I understand that may not apply to all circumstances, but it certainly does apply to to circumstances that, families, that courts encounter every day. So how is somebody with minimum wage supposed to afford to house 4, 5 children without getting assistance from the financially stronger parent who, for maybe, let's say, valid reasons, has very limited parenting time?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I want to emphasize that, we focus on the family, and I heard somebody say that earlier in your meeting, instead of just amounts of child support. But I will share with you that NPO's position is, if you have a barely involved other parent, we have no problem whatsoever. In fact, if they bore the whole cost of raising the child for both parties, I would, and NPO would back increasing the child support in those situations. Now, that's in situations where you have unfit parents that are uninvolved. So we hear that, and we recognize that. We would not suggest taking the housing out if the other parent is not, involved to some reasonable extent in parenting time.
Well, so what is that reasonable extent, that time? What is that, isn't that one reason, maybe not the entire reason, but one reason for having something like a cliff, so that you can avoid a situation where, the children only have a bedroom, every other weekend. And, during the week when they're supposed to focus in school, they have to live with mom in her studio apartment. And, I have all 5 kids on a mattress bed. I'm curious how you guys actually work that out in a situation where one parent has every other weekend.
I could tell you, having been a parent at times with every other weekend, I had to assure that I had a bedroom for my daughters in my place of living. Now, I had 2 children at one point, and I now have 1. What our data addresses is households with 1 child. So we didn't attempt to address the situation you're describing. And certainly when you're dealing with multiple children and disparate incomes, that needs to be considered, absolutely. But our scenario contemplated 1 child, contemplated the parties having the payer $55,000 of income and the other party $45,000, because that is average income data that is provided through one of the research sites. So But again, a very good question that needs to be separately considered. Absolutely. But it just to your point, every other weekend is about 16% time. And, we found ourselves, I found myself, and then I end up, married again later. But I have clothes for my daughter in the house. She doesn't have to carry things back and forth. And she has her own room. And so in many situations, those costs are borne by both parties.
I think Yvette has a question.
I was wondering what the significance was behind eliminating lifestyle to the legislation. Sometimes you have children who, when both parents are together, can afford to have them playing ball or taking college classes or, advancing their education. And if lifestyle is eliminated from that, it is quite possible that the child's life is significantly impacted. And so I was wondering where the advantage to taking lifestyle out for the child has been thought.
I appreciate your question, Yvette. Again, things such as school activities and so on that affect primarily older kids, again, we would recognize that as being something that needs to be separately addressed appropriately. And with the work here in Minnesota, we've talked about that. We have kids that play hockey. It's a very expensive sport for them to participate in. And certainly kids should be encouraged to do extracurriculars and so on. The reality for child support payers too often, and this is data that comes from Stephen Eldred, who's the director of the Orange County Child Support Program in California. He commissioned a study of how does child support affect poverty in regards to the program there. And there was an astounding statistic that came out of that was presented at the policy forum a year and a half ago in DC at the NCA policy forum. And that is that 50%, that's 0.5, one half of child support payers who come in to the program become impoverished by the program. That's a staggering number. And so when you're talking about that number of people that are impoverished as payers, one has to also consider the flat out ability to support some of those types of activities.
And one of the things, you bet, like it is here in Colorado, the extracurriculars and college, that's all beyond child support. And from my perspective, that's where, by trying to conflate that in child support itself, and then trying to, ask the payer to, okay, well, we want to play this sport. I want you to help pay for that expense as well. They, again, can kind of see that as double dipping, if nothing else. So again, that's more conflict. But by separating those extracurriculars like that you listed, that's for those parents to figure out, not in putting, just like it's not today in Colorado, it's not included in child support itself.
There are some instances in which things like uniforms and school supplies are included in child support. And if you have a child that's taking college classes because they are accelerated, that would also be, am I correct, included in child support?
Certainly could be in the basic support order. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to further answer your question, I had a chance, I've had 2-hour-long discussions with Elise in the last month or two here to go over some of our work and answer questions that she had. But one thing I shared with her in my last call, we've been in contact with an organization called Good Plus. It's an organization that was founded by Jessica Seinfeld, who, yes, is the wife of Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian. And it started as an organization called Baby Buggy. She wanted to have her gently used items donated to and being used by other families. And so she grew the organization around that concept. They have many large corporate partners. It's become quite an entity. They're both in New York City and in Los Angeles.
What's the name of the organization again?
It's called Good Plus Foundation.
.org?
You know, the website, I can't tell you right offhand. I apologize. But it's easy to find on Google. Anyway, what I was getting to is as that program developed across the years, they started finding that the households that were in the most desperate need financially were typically father households. And so they ended up several years ago redirecting some of their focus in that area. And it's because of, you know, in part because of high child support orders that occurs. So, you know, they recognized it working out in society. And unfortunately, that also has a disproportionate impact on minority fathers, as the research has shown. So they've talked with us. They're active in some child support initiatives themselves, you know, because of that. And Elise as well recognized, and I'm sure those of you who work, you know, with families directly, you hear the plight of those payer parents, you know, father or mother, in trying to maintain reasonable financial resources when oftentimes they're too limited for both parties, but to have some you know, resources to provide to that child, to have the relationship with the child that the child deserves.
Hey, Roxanne had a question earlier. Roxanne, did you get your question answered?
Thank you. I actually just wanted to reiterate Shar's concern and comment regarding the child care and the child care costs. We know that 1.7 million women lost their jobs during COVID due to child care. I mean, arguably, the COVID pandemic exacerbated the problem, but the child care problem is you know, epidemic in this country, and many women and many women of color are the ones who have to walk away and struggle and survive on nothing to, you know, because of this child care crisis. And so any and all other consideration, and particularly when we look at any of the statistics that were given from in the education, we look at Title I, or we look at the census, or we look at any way that they, you know, that they geocode and how the income, those numbers are years in arrears, 10 years. So I think it is critical that we are very cognizant of what the costs are, because it'll wipe a person out.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that it's assumed that child care would be assessed as part of the child support order. That's assumed. It's not part of what we calculated because we were focused just on the basic support component of it. We recognize there would be an add-on for child care. There'd be an add-on for medical. We understand that and the necessity of it.
Thank you.
And I might say something. When my child support was assessed, I was the cost of childcare was incorporated into that. It has not been changed for 7 years. So we went through a pandemic where there was no childcare necessary. I'll probably still be paying it when she's 18 for childcare because it was incorporated into the child court, the court order, right? So that's one of those things where, you know, I know the costs aren't being incurred, but I'm still paying it.
Just to let you know, in Minnesota, there was a child support task force that followed on to our work group that did our work back in around 2014. And they just came out, the state of Minnesota, with some new legislation in that area to have an annual account and to address trying to keep that from happening here in Minnesota.
And Mr. Ulrich, I'll just note, I think this is a great, robust discussion that we're having. You're scheduled for about 5 more minutes for your presentation. So I want you to be able to get through that presentation. And like Carl said, we'll probably have discussion about this for several meetings to come, if not more. So I do want to stay on track and let you finish your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have an issues and child support booklet that's linked in by the narrative that's supplied with that US map. So when you click on it and read through the narrative that's run, that issues and child support booklet is linked in there. But the parenting time offsets, we talked about the cliffs and the necessity of having 9 states, by the way, do not have any parenting time expense offset whatsoever. Federal OCSE has been encouraging that for years, that be implemented by the states, but there are still 9 states that aren't doing it. Retroactive child support is a very, very problematic area for that are becoming child support payers. It causes them to start in the hole. We too frequently see situations where they've been paying various costs before, support petitions get filed, but where they've not been recognized and significant retroactive orders have been applied. The imputation of income, a very problematic area for a lot of folks. We have people who are paying income in child support withholding and are only able to pay based on imputed income. In this one case, off the top of my head, $1,000 of a $2,000 a month order. So they're going into arrears. They're now in arrears about $30,000 with no end in sight. They came out of a printing industry that was extremely disrupted by the internet age, and the magistrates refused to recognize that. 62 years old, and that does make a difference in the workplace. Self-support reserves. I've had the chance to talk with the Kentucky Child Support Commission. They had no self-support reserve. Then they recently put a $900 a month self-support reserve in place. You can only imagine. I apologize. I forget who was speaking to that. The cost of subsistence living is at least at minimum wage. And there's a study done by MIT linked to Elise on that I encourage you to look at. The self-support reserves tend to hover around poverty income or slightly above it. That's way inadequate. We talked about using standard of living, child support and educational support. I guess they call it educational support. A host of states continue by implementing educational support orders beyond the age of majority. We question the legality of that, for one, when children are emancipated and reach the age of majority, but it treats child support payers very differently than intact families, requirement to do such. And then lastly, and I'll be very quick here, I see my time running out, the federal and state income tax codes, and Elise has some materials on this that I hope she provides to you, already create quite an increased net resources to a household for the recipient parent. There's the head of household filing status. There's a much larger earned income credit. There are child credits, child credits that flow many times to that parent, especially if there's support that is that's patchy and getting paid. It's not uncommon now that if you don't have your child support paid every month, that they will take that away from you. And then lastly, the enforcement measures. And I encourage you to read our Issues in Child Support booklet. It provides some very concise discussion or points about each of these issues. Enforcement measures, just to sum that up, enforcement measures make a great amount of sense for child support evaders. But we have too many folks that are paying child support, but are unable to pay the amounts ordered. And the enforcement measures are brutal against those people. We don't believe that the program even ever intended to create those harms to honest payers trying their best to pay support. But whether it takes 6 months for them to hit a measure versus an evader who pays zero who hits a measure in 3 months, whenever they hit those marks, they're treated the same. And we think that's wholly inappropriate and wholly inequitable. So anyway, with that, I greatly appreciate the chance to present. I'd be happy to stay here and answer any questions. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Hey, Brian, let me ask of you, if you would follow up with, send that an email to Elise or Yvette or to me, and get it in. That's kind of something attaches the issues booklet that you've talked about. Attaches a kind of your template for the cost and and accounting for overnights. I mean the child support suggestion that you're making, kind of the guideline suggestion. And
should I forward? I'll forward all those materials. It'll be about 4 different pieces of information.
Well, won't you do it in a single email with a cover to it, kind of explaining and kind of outlining what you're attaching and the purpose of, and
sure.
And that so all these busy people, again, kind of giving them one place to kind of go to for that information.
I'll send it to Elise, and I'll send it out shortly. And ask. I think she's back on the call, but ask if she can forward that on.
She'll be glad to. And just really, so. If you got 3 or 4 points that you just really want to kind of highlight that you think this commission should be looking at as we look at this quadrennial review, I'd encourage you to to highlight those points as a part of the cover to your email.
Well, I'll quickly get out at least the references to the material so everybody has those right away.
Thank you, Mr. Ulrich, for your time today. You've really given us a lot to think about and look at when we start these discussions for our guideline review. I appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
So it looks like we're scheduled for another break till about 2:10. Is everybody okay having that just be a 5-minute versus a 10-minute break?